Have you ever read a book that feels, well, less like a story and more like you're eavesdropping on someone's private, desperate conversation with God? That is exactly what we're diving into today. We're talking about Saint Augustine's Confessions, truly one of the most raw, influential, and deeply personal books ever written. So, let's unpack this incredible journey.
Just think about that for a second. This isn't just some dusty old book. It's basically the blueprint for every single memoir you've ever read. Seriously. Before Augustine, writing was all about what people did. Big heroic deeds, external stuff. He was the very first to flip that camera around and point it inward, to start mapping that messy, contradictory inner world of a soul at war with itself.
So, what did this soul have to confess? Right? That's the question that drives this entire book. You hear the title Confessions, and your mind immediately goes to sin, to dark secrets, and don't get me wrong, there is plenty of that. But Augustine's story? Oh, it's so much more than just a laundry list of all the bad things he did.
All right, so to really get a handle on his journey, we're going to walk through the 5 major acts of his spiritual quest. We'll start with what confession even means here, then dive into his wild youth, his long search for truth, the huge crisis point in Milan, and finally, what life actually looks like after everything changes. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the format of this book, because it's pretty unique. The most important thing to get is that Augustine, well, he isn't writing to us. He's writing, or maybe it's better to say he's praying, directly to God. The whole book is just one long, continuous conversation with the divine. And this brings us to a really crucial point, the double meaning of the word confession for Augustine. See, for him, it's not just about admitting your sins and weaknesses. It's also about confessing in the sense of declaring or praising God's greatness and mercy. It's an act of praise just as much as it is an act of saying sorry. It's both. And you see this 2-part meaning right from the very first sentence of the book. He doesn't kick things off with a list of his sins. No, he starts with pure awe. He's establishing his audience right from line 1, making it clear that this whole soul-searching journey, everything he's about to say, is happening in the presence of God.
Okay, so with that framework in mind, let's dive into the story of his early life. We're introduced to this young guy who is, well, he's brilliant, he's restless, and he's just driven by all these desires that he can't even begin to understand yet.
His school life was basically a battleground. The stuff he was supposed to learn, he hated it. He calls basic math this hateful sing-song. So what did he love? Oh, the drama, the poetry, the epic stories about heroes like Aeneas. Get this, he admits that he cried over the fate of a fictional character, Queen Dido, but was totally unmoved by the actual state of his own soul.
And this really gets to the core of his emptiness. There was this huge hunger inside him, but he had no idea what he was hungry for. So what'd he do? He just threw all his energy into the act of loving itself. Just desperately searching for something, anything, to pour his passion into. He was, in his own amazing words, in love with loving. And yeah, this search, it led him down a pretty dark path. He dives headfirst into what he calls the madness of lust. But here's where his insight is just so sharp. It wasn't just about the physical act for him. He admits he got a kick out of boasting about his sins. He'd even lie to make himself sound worse than he actually was, just to impress his friends. And when his poor mother, Monica, tried to warn him, he just brushed her off, dismissing it all as womanish advices. But Augustine was way too smart to stay satisfied with just cheap thrills. He had a restless heart, for sure, but he also had an incredibly restless mind. And that mind launched him on this decade-long intellectual quest for some real answers.
And wow, was his path a winding one. First, for 9 whole years, he was all in on Manichaeism. He liked their whole idea of a good god and an evil god battling it out. But then he meets their star teacher, a guy named Faustus, and realizes he's all sizzle and no steak, eloquent but empty. So, totally disillusioned, he swings to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, skepticism, basically believing you can't know anything for sure. It wasn't until he stumbled upon the Platonists that his mind finally cracked open to the idea of a spiritual, non-physical truth.
So you can feel him getting closer, right? His brain is finally catching up. He has the intellectual tools to grasp the concept of God. But his will, his desires, they were still chained up. And that meant the final battle wasn't going to be a philosophical debate. No, it was going to be an agonizing war inside his own heart.
And that brings us to the climax of the entire story. The setting is Milan. On the outside, Augustine is a rising star, a successful professor. But on the inside, he's completely falling apart. So in Milan, he meets the famous Bishop Ambrose. And at first, Augustine just goes to his sermons to, critique his public speaking skills. He was a rhetoric professor after all. But slowly, Ambrose's words start to break through his defenses. And for the first time in his life, Augustine sees that the Catholic faith isn't just for simple-minded folks, it's intellectually solid. His mind is convinced. The problem? His will, his habits, his desires, they just refuse to get on board.
And this is the absolute heart of the crisis, this agonizing paralysis. He talks about having two different wills inside him, an old, habitual one and a new, spiritual one. And they are literally tearing him in two. Part of him wants to change so badly, but another part of him desperately wants not to change. I mean, it is one of the most powerful descriptions of the struggle against addiction or any deeply ingrained habit ever written.
The breaking point finally comes in a garden. A friend tells him this story about two regular guys who converted on the spot after reading a book. Augustine is just overwhelmed with shame at his own indecision and runs out into the garden, a total emotional wreck. And then he hears it, a child's voice from a house nearby, just chanting this phrase over and over, tolle lege, take up and read. He takes it as a sign, grabs the book of St. Paul's letters that was nearby, flips it open to a random page, and his eyes land on a verse telling him to leave his old life behind. And just like that, in that single moment, the war inside him was over.
Now, you might think that's the end of the story, right? Happy ending? But as we're about to see, that dramatic conversion, it isn't the end. In a lot of ways, it's just the beginning of the real confession.
Okay, so the immediate effect of his baptism is just this profound sense of relief. He talks about this incredible feeling of peace, like a massive weight has just been lifted off his shoulders. All that anxiety he had about his past life, poof, it just vanished.
But then, just when you think he's arrived, he completely pivots. With that old anxiety gone, he starts this new, much deeper journey, an exploration into the vast, kind of terrifying and boundless landscape of his own memory. He realizes that the real work, understanding himself, his own mind, well, that's the work of a lifetime.
And this is where the human side of the story gets its beautiful resolution. His mother, Monica, the one who had prayed and cried over him for decades, she lives just long enough to see her life's prayer answered. Shortly after he's baptized, she passes away peacefully, her job done.
And this really is the final, brilliant takeaway from the whole book. The confession shows us that one big moment of conversion, no matter how powerful, doesn't just erase your past or who you are. It just reorients the journey. The struggle doesn't stop. It just transforms into a lifelong, conscious effort to understand yourself.
I mean, Augustine's battle happened 1600 years ago, but doesn't his central conflict feel incredibly modern? That feeling of being torn in two, of knowing what you should do but feeling powerless to actually do it, of searching for truth in a world that's just full of competing ideas, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much has actually changed?